Hey, neuroscientists, it's good to see you. If you're watching this video, it's maybe because you weren't in class the day that we did this slide deck, or perhaps you just want to go back and check in on a few things. So I wanted to introduce you to the nervous system today. You're taking an Understanding the Brain class, and while a lot of our focus is going to be on the way our brain processes information and kind of the psychology of that, it's really important for us to also have a foundation in what the nervous system does for our bodies. So that's what we're going to start today. So this is kind of our first little unit that we're going to have in this class. And so by the end of this unit, you're going to know the 4 functions of the nervous system. So you'll be able to describe what voluntary movement is, perception, homeostasis, and even something crazy called abstract functions or cognition. And so today what I want to do is I'm going to move my little face out of the way here, is to try to map those 4 functions onto our central nervous system. And so what we want to do is try to figure out where the signals for those different functions will originate within the CNS. In our next little portion of this unit, we're going to talk about the stars of the show, the cells that make up the nervous system that are called neurons. And then we want to identify what their parts are and what they do. And then finally, we wouldn't be complete without talking about the neural glial cells. And these are like the supporting cast that work really hard to support those stars of the show, the neurons. All right, so let's just start out with these 4 functions. But to do so, I wanted to start with a story. It turns out our brains are wired for story, and we'll talk more about why that is a little bit later. But I wanted to present the story of Jean-Dominique Bovie, who wrote this really beautiful book, if you haven't read or if you haven't come across it, called The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. And the reason I wanted to talk about Bovie is because it shows us really like the profundity of the nervous system. And so if you're in class, we are, or we would have watched a little video. Loom doesn't let me play a video during a recording like this. So there's a link to it on the portal that you could go to yourself. And it's just like a little, I think 4-minute snippet from the film that was made, which I also highly recommend. It was very well done, talking about his situation. So what was his situation? Well, Jean-Dominique Bovie was 43 years old, and he was the editor of French Elle. And so he had this like really gregarious personality. He was well known for his wit and his kind of ways in the social circles of Paris at the time and fashion. And he was driving in his car with his 10-year-old son, and he suffered a cerebrovascular event, a massive stroke in his brain stem, which left him completely paralyzed except for one part of his body, and that was his left eye. And so he was able to blink his left eye. And there was a remarkable occupational therapist who worked on his team who came up with a system of holding up some alphabet letters on a sheet, and he would blink his answer and was able to spell out words and make requests and ask for different things. And then ultimately, he wrote this just beautiful memoir, this book. I would highly recommend you check it out. And also check out the movie if you can. But so the reason I wanted to share Jean Do's story, or Bovie's story, is because this locked-in syndrome, which is what he had. I get my little face off of here. I'll just have to move it around. So locked-in syndrome means that he was not able to do many of the functions of the nervous system. His cognition was still fully functioning. So this last function of the brain, he was able to do abstract thinking. He could experience and feel emotions, motivation, and even was still primed for social interactions. But a lot of the other functions of his brain weren't working. And it's only recently that we've discovered that this is a possibility for some people who seem to be in what we probably used to call a vegetative state. And so let's talk more about this then. So he had a cerebral vascular event, which just means that a blood vessel ruptured. And then just to remind you what your blood does, your blood carries oxygen and nutrients around to all the cells in your body. And the cells in your brain are called neurons. And they are some of like the hungriest cells of your entire body. And so if they lose oxygen, even for a few minutes, it has really serious consequences. And that's what we saw in the case of Bo B. Oh, I lost my little self here. Okay, so I'm going to move myself over to this side because we already talked a little bit about cognition. And then I want to talk more about these other 3 functions of the nervous system. So Bobby was not able to do any voluntary movement with the exception of that left eye. So when we're talking about something that's voluntary, we mean that it's self-generated. So these are things like talking, any actions that you might take, like picking up a pencil or taking a drink of water. So anything that you're doing on purpose. And sometimes that can include an emotional movement. So if somebody came up and pinched you, you might wince in pain. Or if somebody tickled you, you might have to giggle or laugh. And so sometimes those are sort of we call these emotional movements. The other thing that Bobby lost the ability to do was to perceive, or at least consciously appreciate, sensation in his body, because he was no longer to get that input from the nerves and the rest of his body. He really didn't have a sense of where his body was in space, what, if there was any pain, what other kinds of sensations his body might experience. And so one of the biggest functions of our brain is trying to keep our body within our physiologic limits by this process called homeostasis. We want to keep everything in balance. You've probably come across this idea before. I'm just going to give you a quick example with body temperature. So with the COVID pandemic that we've been living through, we've been taking our temperature pretty often. And you've probably noticed that it changes a little bit day to day. At least for me, I'm somewhere between 97 and 99 most of the time. But I'm never at that like 98.6 that the textbook tells us we should be. But your body has a set range that it wants to keep itself in. And so if you think about that summer day we had earlier in June when it was like 115 degrees here in Seattle, our bodies had to work really hard to keep us cool. And then likewise, when we had that snowstorm, or if you go skiing or spend time in cold areas, your body's working hard to keep you warm. But you're pretty much always within that range of 2 degrees or so. And it's your brain's job to monitor that. And we'll talk more about how that works a little bit later. Okay, so those are the 4 functions: voluntary movement, perception. And by perception, we just mean like what you can consciously appreciate. There's a lot of things that are happening internally that you're not picking up on, that your brain is doing automatically without you even thinking about it. And so we just want to narrowly define perception to like what we appreciate about the world. So what we see, feel, hear, even our emotions. Homeostasis is keeping our body within those limits. And then cognition is all of that stuff that this outer cortex of our brain, the cerebral cortex, allows us to do, which is generally unique to humans, though there are some exceptions that we can talk about later. Okay, so those are our 4 functions. And now what I want to do is just kind of map them onto the brain. So to start with, we're going to have a really simple look at this brain. We're just going to break it down into 3 areas. We'll get in more detail as we go on into the course. But just so you know, your brain is what is inside your skull, right? And we're going to think about it in kind of three layers. And so we have this part at the back, which we call the hindbrain. And that includes your brainstem and the pons and your cerebellum. And so all of those areas are involved in a lot of the things that you don't think about at all, just keeping your body alive. Your midbrain has some other functions. There's even some parts of the endocrine system there. There's some glands that that interact with the brain as well. And then finally, the forebrain is kind of what we think about when we think about our brains. And so let's see where these four functions kind of map onto the CNS. One thing to note about the brain is that the spinal cord is also considered an extension of it. So you have your brain is in your cranium, including your hindbrain. And then there's a little opening at the back of your skull called the foramen magnum. And then the spinal cord extends into your vertebral column. And you can feel that as you kind of palpate the back of your neck. You can feel the little extensions on your vertebra. And so everything is encased in bone in the central nervous system because it's really vital for you. You may have noticed in your own body that all of the things that are vital to life are encased in bone, like your rib cage holds your heart and your lungs, your brain and your spinal column encase your central nervous system. Okay, and we're going to talk later about the peripheral nervous system. So we're just going to kind of ignore that right now, but the peripheral nervous system is everything that's not the brain or spinal cord. Okay, so how do these functions fit in? So kind of the easiest one to think about here is that the idea of cognition and abstract thinking. And this is generally like colloquially and anecdotally as we're talking to our friends or people we know about our brain. This is what we're thinking of when we think about our brain. So all of this is happening entirely in this section that we would call the forebrain. So these are things like language and memory, emotions and cognition, your understanding or your awareness of the world around you. Okay, so the next one we want to talk about is perception. And I need to move my little face again. And perception is, this is your conscious appreciation of what's going on around in the world. And this pretty much happens exclusively in the cerebral cortex. And cortex is just like a fancy science word for saying on top of. So it's all of those peaks and valleys, all the wrinkles that you see in the brain. That's your cerebral cortex. That's where perception happens. Okay, your voluntary movements are decided by your forebrain because you're making choices about what you want to move. But it's really this area of your hindbrain that's in charge of doing the actual moving. Like it's the part that's connected to the motor neurons, which are going to help you move your skeletal muscle. We talked a little bit about this in class, but remember that skeletal muscles are the only muscles you can move voluntarily in your body. You also have smooth muscles. And you have cardiac muscle. Smooth muscles are things like the pupil of your eye that can dilate or get constricted depending on how much light is available. It's also found inside your intestines and it helps you move your food through. So smooth muscle is muscle that you can't control and you don't think about. Cardiac muscle is found in your heart. You also don't think about it. You also can't control it. Your autonomic nervous system takes care of that. We'll get to that later. But so all of these voluntary movements happen through the spinal cord, and they happen through a particular type of cell called a motor neuron. And they're really rare in the nervous system. So our brains probably have, like, best estimates are like around 85 billion neurons in your brain. And then we probably have over 150 billion neurons in our whole body. And only about 100,000 of those are motor neurons. So they're one of the less common types of neurons in the body. Okay, so we've got 3 out of 4. Our last one was homeostasis, and this is kind of a all hands on deck situation. So the whole brain is involved in homeostasis. So it's distributed throughout all 3 regions of the brain. In the forebrain, a lot of that is actually triggered by hormones. So your brain interfaces with your endocrine system. Your endocrine system's in charge of hormones, and you may have heard of hormones, like adrenaline is a hormone, estrogen and testosterone are hormones, and growth hormones. There's lots of different types of hormones. They travel around the bloodstream, but the sort of master of controlling all those hormones is in the middle brain, the midbrain, and also controlled by the forebrain. And so your hindbrain and your spinal column are in charge of the autonomic changes in physiology that we're not even conscious of. So they're controlling our smooth muscles and also interacting with glands in the endocrine system that may or may not need to secrete or stop secreting new hormones. And they also kind of help keeping your heart pumping the way it needs to be. So if you're working out and you need extra oxygen to your cells, your heart's going to pump faster. If you're resting, especially overnight, you're going to have your lowest heart rate of the day. You don't even have to think about that. Your hindbrain and spinal column are taking care of that for you. Not spinal column, sorry, your spinal cord are taking care of that for you. Okay, moving on to the last little bit here. And so the last big idea that we have is that there are two ways to categorize the nervous system. And we're going to think about those in like an anatomic sense. So what do they look like? Where are they in the body? And then we're going to think about those in a functional sense. So like, what do they do? Okay, so we'll start with these anatomic divisions of the nervous system. Here's Vinny. Vinny's just like you. He's got a central nervous system, his brain and spinal cord, and he's got a peripheral nervous system, which is everything else. And so in the central nervous system, we kind of think of that job as kind of information processing. It's getting input from the whole body, inside and out, and you are making decisions for your voluntary movements, and your brain is making decisions for the things that happen automatically. So it's taking in information and then sending it back out and acting on the rest of the body through the peripheral nervous system. And so we think of the peripheral nervous system as everything that is not brain or spinal cord. And from the brain and spinal cord, little nerves descend and leave the brain and spinal cord and find other places to go. It'll become more clear in the next lecture what I mean by that. But any nerves that originate in the brain, so say the ones that control your eyes, like your ocular motor nerves, those are considered a cranial nerve. The rest of your nerves leave your spinal cord. So at every vertebra in your spinal cord, there are little nerve endings that leave from there, and they each control particular regions of the body. So the job of the peripheral nervous system is to bring information to the central nervous system, and then try to affect that change in response to the stimulus. So the central nervous system processes the information and tells your body how to act. Okay, so last but not least, we're going to go through these functional divisions. And I know that you all had an introduction to these when you were working on the POGIL the other day. But I just wanted to kind of clarify because I feel like it gets a little bit wonky. So when we think about our functional divisions, here again, we're splitting up our central nervous system is this green side, brain and spinal cord. We know that that's involved with information processing. So we're just going to leave it at that for right now. But we know that our peripheral nervous system actually has a lot of other jobs to do. And so there are two main categories. So we have our somatic system. Hang on a second. Let's see if I can get my highlighter to pop up here. Laser pointer. Okay, so we've got our somatic system. And this word soma, you're going to see fairly frequently in when we talk about the nervous system. And soma just means body. So that's the scientific word for body, or like that's the root word. So when we're talking about the somatic system, we're talking about things that happen. So any sensory input that comes in is going to go back up to the central nervous system. And then the central nervous system is going to want to affect change through that somatic system. And it's going to control your skeletal muscles to move your body. So that's the somatic sensory input coming in, and then an effect of change coming out. And then we want to think about the stuff that we can't control. We consider that autonomic, or you could think of it as automatic. So these are kind of self-regulated action of your internal organs and your endocrine glands. And so within that, I'm not going to worry about this very much right now. We will get back to it. But within your autonomic system, you have two kind of parallel nerve bundles. So you have one that's in charge of arousing your body. So if your heart rate needs to go up, this sympathetic nervous system is going to kick in. When it's time for your heart rate to slow down, this other branch of the nervous system is going to kick in and calm it down. So sometimes you hear people say that the sympathetic nervous system is kind of like your flight or fight response because it amps you up. And your parasympathetic nervous system is something more like your rest and digest nervous system. We'll talk a lot more about these later, but I just wanted to give you kind of the general overview. Okay, so in class, or if you're at home, I'll put all the documents you need up on Google Classroom. I'm going to have you try some stuff out. So you're going to work with a partner. You'll go through, there's a little activity sheet that you're going to go through on the handout. There's some data to record, and mostly it's just to kind of get a sense for what your nervous system is capable of. And then finally, there is a coloring page to work on. And I'm a visual person, and I find coloring pages, or the anatomic coloring pages, to be really, really helpful. And so what you'll find is that there is some text that gives you a lot of information about what you're looking at. And then you'll have some bubble letters that name a part. And then you'll color in the bubble letters with the color that you're also going to color in that anatomic part with, so that you have yourself a nice little key. And sometimes it even suggests colors for you, but you can do your own thing. There are colored pencils in the classroom. I think colored pencils work a little bit better because sometimes the dark markers end up kind of over coloring, and it's harder to tell what's up. Okay, I feel like I've probably been talking for a long time now. Yeah, 20 minutes. That's way too long. I'm going to go.